Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan. It's been 1 year since NATO planes bombed a hospital in Condos, Afghanistan, run by Médecins Sans Frontières, the leading health care provider in many areas of conflict around the world. That terrible bombing led to the death of over 40 people, Médecins Sans Frontières employees, staff, hospital patients, caretakers. And over the past year, the MSF has spent an enormous amount of energy trying to ensure that there's some kind of accountability, some kind of truth-telling for that particular incident. Joining me to discuss the Condos incident 1 year on and the work of MSF globally is the India head of Médecins Sans Frontières, Peter-Paul de Groote. Welcome to the show, Peter-Paul. It's a pleasure to have you. This has been a painful period for MSF, and this is a painful week because we recently commemorated the first anniversary of that terrible bombing. We will discuss that bombing in detail and its consequences and what's happened over the past year in some detail. But for the benefit of viewers who may not be that familiar with the work that MSF does, give us a brief history of the organization, how it got started, and the remit or its mandate that it sees, and the areas of operation currently around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. Yeah, MSF, also known as Doctors Without Borders, which maybe is easier for the Indian public, is an independent medical humanitarian organization that was founded in 1971. It was founded by our French section. That's why we have the name Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, the French name. And it happened during the war in Biafra in Nigeria, where it was very clear to doctors working for another organization where they were not able to speak out on things, that it was not only about medical action, but they also wanted to bring the suffering of those people to the rest of the world. So the combination of a medical action, witnessing and speaking out on things is where MSF came from. So over the years, MSF has grown a lot worldwide. So we have offices in many countries around the world. But the most important thing is that we work in conflict zones. We work with natural disasters, epidemics, but we work very independently. So that means that we're getting our money mainly from private donors. So we don't want to be associated with institutional donors, with governments. We want to make our own decisions in a very independent way. So that's what we do. And we work in a very neutral and impartial way. So for us, we never take sides. That's the reason we can work in those very difficult places, because we don't belong to the conflict itself. We go there as medical professionals to carry out our work. And impartiality means that we mainly work with based on needs. So our medical professionals will choose which people need care most, and that's the only baseline that we use to treat people. So that's a little bit where MSF comes from.
So apart from, I mean, what distinguishes MSF in some ways from other organizations that are in the, shall we say, the aid space or the human rights space or the anti-conflict space, is that you actually focus on the provision of concrete medical services for the victims of conflict or the victims of, say, a pandemic?
Yes. So we do direct, hands-on work.
Right.
So we directly treat patients. We don't work through partners. MSF works very directly. We're not a developmental organization. We're a humanitarian organization. So that distinguishes slightly from others. We're also not a human rights organization, to make that very clear. We are a humanitarian organization with people who decide to go and work in places, with a lot of people from the countries that we work to give direct medical aid to those who need it most in a very neutral fashion.
And not always to do with conflict. I mean, Ebola or other kinds of pandemics which countries may be unable to cope with would find MSF going there to help out.
Absolutely. Ebola, I think, is a very prime example. Where we have massive operations in West Africa. Yeah. And others would be, for example, HIV/AIDS or TB, where we work in many places around the world to deal with those problems.
And how large an organization would you say Doctors Without Borders is? Do you have a large roster of medical personnel and doctors, surgeons on your roles permanently, or do you have people in on a short-term basis or a contract basis?
It varies a bit. People normally go out on a relatively short-term basis. That can be anything from 3 months to a year, depending on the context that they're working. Total numbers I don't know exactly, but I think we have about 3,000 expatriates working, but we have mainly, and that's important, 40 to 50,000 national staff worldwide that are working. So it's a sizable organization. People, because of the difficult context we work, often don't work for very long periods, and then they go home to refresh and then hopefully go out again.
That would be the expats, but obviously the locals are there pretty much.
They are the
permanently.
backbone of what we do, because otherwise we would not be able
and
to carry out this work.
that's a large organization, 40 to 50,000 local staff on top of expatriate doctors puts you in a pretty massive category.
It is. It's a very big.
And apart from Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, where else would you say MSF has a priority focus right now?
We're working in 65 countries around the world. So many of the countries are in Africa. I just came back myself from South Sudan. I worked for a year in South Sudan. We work in West Africa. We work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We work in Kenya. We used to work in Somalia. Unfortunately, we had to leave there. But we work in many places.
You had to leave because of dangers or threats?
In this case, it was the security of our staff that was not guaranteed at that moment. That's right.
And in India, what does MSF have activities and operations, or is this essentially an outreach office here?
No, we do have operations throughout the country on HIV/AIDS, on hepatitis C. So yes, we are engaging in India as well.
Right. And you'll be working with the health ministry or the government agencies at different levels, or
absolutely,
quite
we're always
independently
engaging with authorities wherever we work.
Right.
Because that's
right. But not in terms of any internal conflict or internally displaced persons. We have some examples. Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, the Northeast, where from time to time you have fairly large populations of IDPs. Is that something which MSF gets into, or is it your work mainly limited to some of the diseases that you mentioned?
That we work sometimes in difficult places, but it's always a disease-focused approach.
Okay. But now let's turn our attention to the Condos bombing, because that's really been top of the mind for this whole week. October 3rd, 2015, describe for our viewers events leading up to and on the day that the MSF facility, the MSF hospital in Condos was bombed. Did you have any inkling? Was there shelling? Were there attacks of one kind or the other that led MSF to be apprehensive, or did this bombing come completely out of the blue? And give us a bit of the history of the Condos hospital itself.
Yeah, now the Condos hospital started in 2011. Started as a small hospital, and over time it grew. Also because of the conflict, it became the main trauma center for the whole region.
So pretty much the entire province.
The entire province, indeed. Yeah. So over time that became a very big hospital. We improved the hospital infrastructure. We improved the quality of care, which is always free. We always give care for free, health care. And on the 3rd of October, just before, there was an attack on Condos. So there was increased fighting, which led to a lot more patients coming to our trauma center to seek health care. The attack on the hospital came completely out of the blue, because for us, a hospital in a conflict setting is a safe haven. That's a place that not only because of the legal system, but everyone knows that a hospital is a place where people are treated regardless of who they are, because they need medical treatment. So we were for us it was quite clear that our people could work there to treat everyone that came in. And then suddenly the attack, I think it was 2 a.m. in the morning, came out of the blue. So the hospital was attacked, and as you said, over 40 people, 14 of my own colleagues, 24 of our patients, and some of the caretakers were killed in that attack, and that is a real tragic incident.
Now, just to clarify for our viewers, the hospital gets established in the conflict zone. This is a pretty hot conflict zone, because Condos is one of those areas where the Taliban, from time to time, has the upper hand. It's been attacking the Afghan National Army and the Western coalition that supports the government. There have been pretty fierce fights over the past 5 or 6 years. You, as a matter of precaution, had informed the Afghan government and NATO and the US and even the Taliban about the precise coordinates of the hospital, so that there could be no question of mistaken targeting?
Absolutely, and that is also our standard way of operating in any area.
Okay.
So when we open a hospital like that in a conflict zone, we will make sure that all the parties, first of all, know what we are doing. We are very transparent about our activities, very clear about our neutrality, that we don't belong to any of the sides. We're purely there to deliver healthcare. And we give the GPS coordinates. So both parties are fully aware.
So this is standard operating procedure of MSF in any conflict zone?
It is, absolutely.
Congo or South Sudan or Afghanistan?
Regardless of where we
you
are.
would, when you go there, try to discuss, have negotiations or dialogue with the conflicting parties and hand over to them the GPS coordinates?
Absolutely.
Okay.
For us, it's also important because if we don't get those commitments, then it will be impossible for our staff to operate there, to be operational. And it's something that we've had in some places. If we don't get the strongest commitment from both parties that they respect the fact that we are there and understand what we are doing, then sometimes we will have to say, sorry, but we cannot work here because it's too dangerous. Our staff takes risks. They know, they go to a conflict zone. If you go to a conflict zone, you do take risk. But what they do not expect is to be at risk in the hospital itself, because that should be a safe haven. And that's why we take all these measures to inform everyone and to get commitments and guarantees from people.
And just to clarify again, during the course of the dialogue that Doctors Without Borders would have had with the coalition forces and even the Taliban, did you sense or did MSF sense any suspicion on the part of one party or the other that MSF coming there might not be such a good idea, that maybe the US felt that Condos being a Taliban stronghold, your hospital would likely benefit them, or perhaps the Taliban was suspicious that since MSF is essentially a Western-led humanitarian organization, that your entry there might serve as a bridgehead for coalition forces. Did you get any sense that the one party or the other looked at MSF with a little bit of suspicion?
I was personally not part of those discussions,
right, of course.
I wasn't there. But what I do know is that normally when we start discussions, there is some suspicion, not so much towards us, but how are you helping the other party? So that's why we explain our neutrality. So normally these discussions is not a one-day discussion. That takes a bit of time to build that confidence, to explain to people why we are there and how we operate. And the moment that they see how we do that and they give us the trust back, we say, okay, fine, now we can work. So I do know that in Afghanistan, we were at a level that we know that people were fully aware of where we were and what we did. So for us, there was no reason to believe that we shouldn't be there.
And the hospital was hit by a missile or a series of missiles?
Series of missiles.
And during that intervening period, messages were also sent to the US, reminding them that this is a hospital, this is a medical facility.
The messages went to our headquarters in Kabul.
That they should stand down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We were in direct contact straight away with our own headquarters in Kabul, who were then in contact with the forces who were attacking us.
Okay. Now, we know over the last 10 years that there have been a number of, shall we say, less than precise, so-called surgical strikes by NATO, targets that were ostensibly meant to be military or of insurgents. Wedding parties have been hit. Perhaps yours was not the first hospital either. I seem to recall other medical facilities also taking a hit. In this instance, the US says, or the immediate response was that we came under fire and that ours was a proportionate military response to what was a threat and fully consistent with our rules of engagement. Now, MSF has contested that, and since then there's been some pushback. How would you characterize the shifting nature of the American response to this particular incident as new evidence and new facts emerged?
Yeah. Now, the US has acknowledged that this was a mistake.
Right.
So they called it a human error.
Right. How long?
Combined with a technical fault why this was happening.
How long did it take them to make that basic acknowledgement that they were wrong?
That took them several months to come to that conclusion. I can't remember the exact date, but it took them quite a while to come to that conclusion. Why do we contest that? Because there was in the beginning a clear accusation that we were harboring, or not us harboring, people were harboring in the hospital. We have a very clear policy. Our policy is a no-gun policy.
Okay.
So all our medical facilities are free of weapons, because otherwise we would not be seen as neutral, and this is for us is a sacred thing. So it's been very clear that that's the message that we gave out before we started, while we were working and while we were being shelled. So we've always made it very clear, no, the only people that are there are patients and staff.
So the Taliban would not be allowed by your hospital staff to bring weapons in.
Absolutely
That would be a rule. And were they abiding by that? The Taliban are not known to follow the normal rules of war, but in this instance, are you certain that they were indeed following that?
Absolutely certain,
Right.
and they were following it. And for us, it's very clear. If they don't follow that, we would not be able to work there.
Right. And,
So
you would just pack up and leave
We would.
if you had consistent violation of your norms by one side or the other.
If those violations would be ongoing and in the dialogue we could not solve that, that would
Right.
be indeed the case.
Right. What do you say to the argument that some people made in the initial days after the bombing, particularly when it emerged that this was a hospital and that there perhaps wasn't firing on U.S. forces? That, well, since the majority of people taking advantage of medical care were trauma victims, battlefield injury people who might have been Taliban, there may have been some combatants even if they were not armed. In your view, is international law, international humanitarian law, crystal clear on the inviolability of a medical facility, even if it is treating combatants suffering from battlefield injuries?
Crystal clear to me. It's any fighter from whoever side who
Right.
is injured becomes a patient, is a civilian. We as a medical organization, we treat people based on the medical needs only.
Yeah.
We do not look at where they're from, which party they belong to. So for us, it's very clear, and for our doctors and nurses, especially our doctors who have signed an oath, it's about treating someone who is in need.
Right.
So again, we will not allow people in with weapons, but anyone who's injured, anyone who is in need of desperate medical care, we will treat.
And this will be the immunity of a hospital in conflict zone, even if it is treating injured soldiers or combatants, is guaranteed by the Geneva Conventions,
Absolutely.
to which the US and pretty much every country in the world is a state party.
It is, that's
Right,
the case.
Right.
Yeah.
So when the law is pretty clear, international law and international humanitarian law, why has it been so difficult for MSF, despite the enormous goodwill you enjoy around the world? I dare say, even in Afghanistan, the US would have a positive appraisal of the work that you do. Why has it been so difficult for you as an organization to extract from the United States information about how and why the raid took place, and to get the US to agree to your fundamental or basic demand, which is that there should be an independent inquiry into the incident?
That's exactly what it is. So they've done their own inquiry, but it means that someone has done an inquiry, also have done the act in the first place.
Okay.
So the only thing we're asking for is an independent inquiry that very clearly states the facts before we can see really what happened. And indeed, we have failed so far to get that done. We were hoping that through the new resolution by the UN Security Council, which was adopted in May unanimously, that there would be mechanisms in place to start these independent inquiries. But so far, and I think it's also important maybe to take it a little bit out of Condos. Condos was one of the most tragic incidents we have encountered as an organization, as a one go where we've seen a lot of loss of life of our staff and patients. Unfortunately, it's part of a much bigger thing.
Right.
Because we see many hospitals being targeted. Just in the last year, we had over 80 hospitals that are either MSF run or MSF supported hospitals who were targeted. And
Where?
that's the tip
In Afghanistan or around the world?
Afghanistan, but mainly in Syria and Yemen.
Okay.
So it's mainly in those two places, but also other places. I was explaining that I just came back from South Sudan last year. Exactly on the day of the attack in Condos, we evacuated a team from a hospital in South Sudan because it was being targeted and looted for the fourth time in 1.5 years. So also there was no respect for the medical facilities. And what happens is that all these facilities that have been targeted means that people are without health care. So one is the tragic thing about our own staff and the patients, which is really difficult. It's extremely painful for an organization. But the other impact is that patients have nowhere to go anymore. So that's not only the wounded from the conflict, that can also be a child with pneumonia, that can be a woman in labor who's got complications.
So you're dealing with patients actually who not just trauma or battlefield or weapon-related injuries, but the full range, the full range of issues that people in a conflict zone or even in a poor society may suffer from.
Absolutely. Very often we are the only hospital left that gives free healthcare, quality healthcare. And if that hospital is not there, many people cannot seek healthcare. And there's of course a lot more going on than only the people who are injured by the violence.
Now the UN, you mentioned the UN Security Council resolution. I mean, it was a pretty dramatic and quite far-reaching resolution, passed unanimously with the full support of permanent members of the Security Council. However, many of the countries that sponsored or voted for that resolution are themselves involved in conflicts where hospitals are being targeted, perhaps accidentally, or certainly one can say at the very least that not enough due diligence is being applied by militaries. The US is one country, Russia in Syria, the Saudi Arabian Air Force in Yemen. Yeah. Was that resolution just window dressing? Was it just a kind of grandstanding by the international community, which really is otherwise quite comfortable with giving their military the widest possible latitude in the conflict?
That's a question you should ask them directly, but so far it does look like window dressing to us, because it was adopted 5 months ago. In those 5 months we have seen unabated attacks on many of the health facilities. So things are ongoing, and so we don't see any practical implementation of that resolution on the ground. So it's very nice to put something on paper. It's very nice to make strong commitments in a place like the Security Council. But if that's not translated to action, then we don't know what it stands for. So that's why we're calling upon to make that resolution practical. Because the resolution,
maybe have a monitoring committee of some kind, or some kind of investigative arm.
Sorry, say that again.
Some kind of investigative mechanism as part of that?
There is, and if you look at the resolution, it does state all kind of things. It does state that there should be independent inquiries. There's all kind of mechanisms that can be put in place. Nothing of that has been activated. Right. And as you stated very correctly, 4 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are directly part of coalitions that are attacking these hospitals. So they should really be held accountable. Right. They should really come forward, and we don't see that happening. So if it's window dressing, so far it looks very much like window dressing.
Would it be fair to say that part of the reason why MSF is pushing so hard for accountability in the case of Condos is, of course, that you've lost colleagues and you've lost patients, and it's important for your work, but also that establishing in one precedent the importance of respect for the rules of war might actually then put pressure on other combatants in other conflict zones? Is that your hope, that by pushing the envelope on this front, this might make the Saudis or the Russians or other combatants more sensitive?
It's a combination. First and foremost, it's about what happened in Condos itself. We want to see justice, we want to have accountability on that, we want to see what's happening there. But of course it has another impact, and that impact is that people really start taking the protection of medical facilities, the staff and the patients, more serious. That they do respect the legal and the moral aspect of it. Often these hospitals are the last place of humanity in a very inhumane environment. And if you take that away, where do we go? What is happening then? If we don't abide by the laws of international humanitarian law, where do we go? Where will it end up? That we say personally that a war without limits will lead to a battlefield without doctors.
Right.
No one can seek healthcare anymore. And that is, the laws were made for a reason. Right. And those reasons are that people can seek healthcare even in the most difficult circumstances of their life.
Right. On that note, Peter Paul de Groote, we're completely out of time. But thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Indian Standard Time.
Thank you very much, Siddharth.
Well, that wraps up things for this week. Do join me again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.